Hello dear friends, and welcome to Edward's Sleep Mysteries. I'm Edward, and I'm glad you've chosen to spend these quiet moments with me. Before we begin, take a moment to notice the evening around you. The stillness, the soft sounds, the way the day slowly fades. If you feel like sharing, tell me in the comments what helps you relax most at this hour. If you enjoy these gentle stories, you're warmly invited to subscribe. Now, make yourself comfortable and let the night unfold. Chapter 1. A Village Polished for the Season. There are villages in England which seem to have been designed, not by the ordinary processes of history and habitation, but by some benevolent committee determined that all should be agreeable to the eye and soothing to the spirit. Larkspur End was such a place. It sat in a gentle fold of the countryside, neither too grand to be thought presumptuous, nor too modest to escape notice, and it conducted itself with the quiet satisfaction of a household that has just completed its spring cleaning, and now awaits the approving glance of visitors. In the weeks preceding Christmas, this natural disposition toward order intensified into something approaching a mania for perfection. Windows were scrubbed until they protested with squeaks of surrender. Hedges were trimmed with such precision that one might have suspected the employment of a mathematical instrument rather than common shears. Door knockers of brass received such zealous attention that they gleamed with an almost accusatory brightness, as if to suggest that any hand which approached them should first examine its conscience along with its knuckles. The shopkeepers of Larkspur End entered into the spirit of the season with determined cheerfulness. Mr. Appleby, the grocer, arranged his windows with pyramids of preserved fruits and towers of tea canisters that would have done credit to an architect of some ambition. Mrs. Threadgold, who presided over the haberdashery with the authority of a general reviewing troops, festooned her establishment with ribbons and trimmings in shades that recalled both the holly and the ivy, though whether she intended this symbolism or merely purchased what was available at wholesale prices remained a matter for speculation. It was not merely the physical appearance of Larkspur End that received such careful tending in this season. Reputations too were quietly burnished. Old grievances were, if not forgotten, at least temporarily, set aside with the understanding that they might be retrieved after Twelfth Night should the need arise. Charitable acts were performed with a calculation that would have impressed a banker, for it was well understood that to give too little invited censure, while to give too much suggested either ostentation or guilt. Among the inhabitants of this well-ordered community, certain figures stood forth with particular prominence, not through any deliberate seeking of attention, but through the simple fact that a village, like a theatrical production, requires its principal players. Mr. Nathaniel Brooke was not a man whom one noticed immediately, which was perhaps the very quality that made him indispensable. As parish clerk, he occupied a position of modest authority and immodest usefulness. He was to be found wherever organisation was required, but recognition was not sought. If the parish registers needed updating, Mr. Brooke attended to them with a hand so neat that the letters seemed to have been inscribed by some patient monk of an earlier century. If the church required sweeping before a service, Mr. Brooke could be discovered with broom in hand, pursuing dust with the gentle persistence of a philosopher pursuing truth. He was a man of perhaps 40 years, though one could not say with confidence, for his features had that quality of settled tranquillity which makes precise age a matter of conjecture. His hair was brown and tidy, his coat was respectable without being remarkable, his manner was mild without being weak. In short, he was the sort of person who might pass through a room and leave behind only the vague impression that someone had been helpful. Mrs. Violet Henscombe occupied quite a different position in the social landscape of Larkspur End. Where Mr. Brooke was retiring, she was forthcoming. Where he preferred the background, she commanded the foreground with a graciousness that was as calculated as it was genuine. Her home stood on the high street with an air of conscious elegance, its windows dressed with curtains of such studied, tasteful fullness that they seemed to offer a silent lecture on the proper conduct of domestic life. She was a widow of some 10 years' standing, a circumstance which had released her from the necessity of consulting a husband, while preserving all the respectability of the married state. Her teas were events of importance. Her opinions on village matters carried weight. Her approval was sought, and her disapproval, while never expressed with vulgar directness, could be conveyed through the subtle adjustment of a smile or the precisely timed offering of a biscuit. The Reverend Julian Frost completed this trinity of prominence. He was a young man, or at least young by the standards applied to clergymen, being barely 35. He had come to Larkspur End with earnest intentions and a determination that his ministry should be marked by harmony rather than controversy. This admirable goal he pursued with such diligence that he sometimes mistook the avoidance of difficulty for the achievement of virtue. He was not unintelligent, but he possessed that particular form of intelligence which expresses itself chiefly in the ability to see all sides of a question and, having seen them, to retreat into platitudes that offended no one and satisfied few. His sermons were notable for their brevity and their determined cheerfulness. He spoke of Providence as if it were a benevolent uncle who could be relied upon to send occasional gifts and to overlook minor infractions of good conduct. As Christmas approached, the Reverend moved through the village with an air of gentle anxiety, ensuring that all was prepared, all was harmonious, and nothing would disturb the observances of the season. He visited the sick with punctuality, though with rather less imagination than might have been wished. He consulted with Mr. Brooke on matters of organisation with the relief of a man who knows he need not trouble himself with details. He took tea with Mrs. Henscombe and assured her that all would be splendid, an assurance she received with the graciousness of one who had never doubted it. And so Larkspur End moved toward Christmas night with confidence and satisfaction. The church was decorated with evergreens gathered from the surrounding woods. The candles were new and numerous. The hymn books had been inspected for completeness, and those pages which had gone missing through either accident or deliberate removal had been replaced with insertions written in Brooke's exemplary hand. There was to be a gathering after the Christmas service, a customary affair in which the villagers would assemble in the church hall to share mulled wine and conversation, to admire one another's best clothing, and to feel that pleasant glow of communal satisfaction which comes from having fulfilled one's obligations with competence and style. Yet there lingered, just beneath this smooth surface of preparation and anticipation, something that could not quite be named. It was not foreboding precisely, nor was it suspicion. It was rather that quality of tension which precedes not disaster, but revelation, the sense that something carefully arranged is about to be gently, perhaps inevitably, disturbed. The village itself seemed unaware of this subtle undercurrent. It polished and prepared. It smiled and nodded. It moved toward Christmas with the confidence of a community that has examined itself and found all to be in order. But appearances, however carefully maintained, have a way of cracking when pressed. And Christmas night was approaching. Chapter 2. The evening that would not sit easily. Christmas night arrived in Larkspur End with all the punctuality of an invited guest who knows himself to be expected and who would not dream of causing inconvenience through tardiness. The church bells rang out across the village with that particular clarity which cold air lends to sound, each peal seeming to hang in the darkness for a moment before giving way to its successor, like phrases in a measured conversation. The church itself presented a scene of considerable warmth and welcome. Candles had been lit with such abundance that the interior glowed with a soft radiance, casting gentle shadows that danced upon the stone walls as if the very building were participating in the celebration. The evergreens which adorned the pillars and windowsills released their sharp, clean scent into air, already sweet with the mingling of many perfumes and pomades applied in honour of the occasion. The congregation assembled with that mixture of solemnity and satisfaction which characterises a community that has fulfilled its preparations and now awaits the reward of its labours. The ladies wore their finest bonnets, those monuments to millinery ambition which had been stored carefully throughout the year for precisely such moments of display. The gentlemen had brushed their coats and combed their whiskers until both gleamed with respectability. The children, scrubbed and warned into temporary good behaviour, sat with an unnatural stillness that suggested either exceptional piety or the credible threat of consequences. The Reverend Julian Frost conducted the service with evident pleasure, his voice carrying through the familiar words with the ease of one who has spoken them often enough to find comfort in their repetition. His sermon touched upon themes of generosity, gratitude, and communal harmony, with such gentle insistence that even those members of the congregation who harboured private grievances found themselves nodding selves in agreement, though whether they intended to act upon these sentiments after leaving the church remained an open question. Mr. Nathaniel Brooke occupied his customary position near the front, his prayer book held at precisely the correct angle, his responses delivered with quiet accuracy. He had ensured that the service books were properly distributed, that the collection plates were positioned conveniently, and that the elderly Mrs. Pemberton had a cushion for her troubled back. These attentions he performed with such unobtrusive efficiency that they went largely unnoticed, which was exactly as he preferred. Mrs. Violet Henscombe sat in a pew whose location suggested both prominence and modesty, for it was neither so far forward as to appear presumptuous, nor so far back as to indicate insufficient enthusiasm. Her expression throughout the service maintained that careful balance between devotional sincerity and social awareness which marks the accomplished participant in public worship. She sang the hymns with conviction, though not so loudly as to draw attention. She bowed her head during prayers with precisely measured reverence. When the service concluded, the congregation filed out into the night with the orderly purposefulness of soldiers who have completed a successful manoeuvre and now proceed to the next objective. That objective, understood by all, was the gathering in the church hall, where mulled wine and various edibles awaited their consumption, and where the business of being neighbourly could be conducted with appropriate festivity. The hall had been transformed through efforts both collective and considerable. Long tables bore the evidence of many kitchens, for the ladies of Larkspur End had contributed their specialties with competitive generosity. There were mince pies of various provenance, each maker silently confident of superiority. There were sweet biscuits decorated with such artistry that consuming them seemed almost an act of vandalism. There were savoury offerings whose steam rose into the lamplight like signals of domestic triumph. Mr. Brooke had overseen the arrangement of these provisions with his characteristic attention to detail. The cups for the mulled wine stood in neat rows. The napkins had been folded with geometric precision. Everything spoke of order and anticipation. The villagers entered with that particular form of enthusiasm which involves much greeting, considerable exclamation, and the general agreement that everything was splendid. Conversations bloomed like winter flowers forced in a hothouse. Laughter, perhaps slightly louder than necessary, filled the spaces between words. The Reverend moved among his flock with visible satisfaction, accepting compliments on the service with the modesty of one who believes them entirely deserved. It was during this crescendo of communal contentment that the small disruption occurred. A frame had been prepared, meant to be displayed prominently, near the entrance to the hall. It contained a list, rendered in careful calligraphy, of those who had contributed to a charitable fund established some years previous for the benefit of the village poor. The display of such a list was customary, even expected, serving both to honour generosity and to remind others of their obligations. The frame itself was handsome, its glass polished to transparency, its wood carved with modest flourishes appropriate to the occasion. Yet when the moment came for its unveiling, when Mrs. Henscombe herself moved toward it with the evident intention of drawing attention to this evidence of communal virtue, the frame was not in its expected position. There was a moment of confusion, that particular quality of social awkwardness which arises when expectations meet absence. Mrs. Henscombe paused, her hand extended toward empty air. Several persons who had been preparing to gather round the display found themselves gathering round nothing whatsoever, which gave them an appearance of unusual purposelessness. Mr. Brooke stepped forward with quiet apology in his manner. He explained in tones of gentle regret, removed the frame. There had been, he suggested with careful vagueness, a clerical oversight. Certain details required verification. It would not do to display information that might be inaccurate. Better to wait until all could be confirmed. He hoped everyone would understand. Surely they would understand. The explanation was delivered with such mild reasonableness that objection seemed churlish. Mr. Brooke's face expressed nothing but concern for accuracy and propriety. His hands, as he gestured gently toward the absent frame, conveyed only earnest regret at the necessity of this small postponement. The Reverend Frost, quick to smooth any ripple in the evening's harmony, assured the assembled company that the oversight was entirely understandable and that the display would certainly appear in due course when all was properly arranged. He spoke with the conviction of one who believes that stating a thing confidently makes it true. Most of the villagers accepted this explanation with the ease of persons who have more immediate concerns, such as securing a cup of mulled wine before the supply diminishes, or positioning themselves for conversation with socially advantageous neighbours. The matter was dismissed with shrugs and murmurs. Life, after all, is full of minor inconveniences, and Christmas is not the time to dwell upon them. Yet not everyone resumed their festivity with complete conviction. Mr. Edmund Rowley, a retired solicitor of thoughtful disposition and observant nature, stood slightly apart from the general merriment. He was a man who had spent his professional life noting small details and drawing from them conclusions, both logical and occasionally uncomfortable. His retirement had not diminished this habit, merely redirected it towards subjects of less commercial significance. He watched Mr. Brooke return to his duties of attending to cups and napkins. He observed Mrs. Henscombe recover her composure with admirable swiftness, though her smile perhaps required slightly more effort than before. He noticed the Reverend's determined cheerfulness, which seemed to protest its own sincerity through excessive repetition. The evening proceeded. Wine was consumed. Pies were praised. Conversation flowed with the particular freedom that comes from communal satisfaction and seasonal goodwill. Beneath the surface of this continued festivity, something had shifted. It was nothing that could be named precisely, nothing that could be pointed to with confidence. It was merely the sense, faint but persistent, that the smooth surface upon which Larkspur End conducted its social life had developed the smallest of cracks. The explanation had been accepted, but the unease remained, and as the gathering eventually dispersed into the cold night as the villagers made their ways homeward, with expressions of mutual esteem and seasonal blessing, more than one person carried with them a question they had not quite formed, and a doubt they would not quite acknowledge. Christmas night in Larkspur End had been observed with all due ceremony, but it would not perhaps sit easily in memory. Chapter 3. Courtesies that slipped a little. The days following Christmas possess a peculiar quality in English village life, being neither quite holiday nor quite ordinary, but rather a suspended interval during which the energy expended in preparation slowly dissipates like steam from a kettle removed from the fire. Larkspur End entered this period with its customary attention to propriety, yet something in the atmosphere had altered, as subtle as a change in the light, but as pervasive as the winter fog that sometimes crept up from the valley. Conversation, that great engine of village existence, returned repeatedly to the matter of the missing list. This was not accomplished through direct inquiry or vulgar speculation, but rather through the indirect methods which polite society has perfected for the discussion of matters it pretends not to discuss. A remark about charitable giving in general would lead, by imperceptible degrees, to a recollection of the fund in particular. An observation about the excellence of the Christmas gathering would somehow drift toward a mention of what had been absent rather than what had been present. Mrs. Threadgold, while measuring ribbon for Miss Ashford's spring bonnet, recalled with apparent casualness that Mr. Leonard Pike's name had been mentioned prominently in connection with the fund, though she could not quite remember the precise nature of his contribution. Miss Ashford, examining the ribbon with unnecessary attention, observed that Mr. Pike had always been generous in matters where generosity was likely to be noted, a comment delivered with such studied neutrality that its implications floated in the air like dust motes in sunlight. At the bakery, Mrs. Cutler remarked to Mrs. Pemberton that she had always understood Miss Clara Dewhurst to have been instrumental in organising the charitable fund, though Miss Dewhurst herself seemed curiously reluctant to speak of it now. Mrs. Pemberton, selecting a loaf with elaborate care, suggested that perhaps some persons preferred their good works to remain unmentioned, though whether this preference arose from modesty or from other considerations she did not venture to specify. These conversations possessed the quality of careful needlework, each stitch small and seemingly innocent, yet contributing to a pattern that grew more distinct with each addition. No one said anything that could be considered improper. No one made accusations or spread malicious tales. Yet gradually, through this accumulation of half-finished thoughts and artfully deployed hesitations, a sense of unease spread through the village like ivy creeping up a wall. Mr. Edmund Rowley observed these developments with the practised eye of one who had spent decades watching human nature express itself through the medium of legal disputes. He was not a man given to hasty judgment, having learned through professional experience that the obvious explanation is often merely the most convenient rather than the most accurate. Yet he found himself troubled by what he witnessed, not because anything dramatic had occurred, but precisely because nothing had. The absence of the donor list should have been forgotten within a day or two, dismissed as the minor administrative confusion it purported to be. Instead, it lingered in the collective consciousness of Larkspur End like an uninvited guest who, having been asked to leave, instead settles more deeply into the best chair and shows no sign of departing. What puzzled Mr. Rowley most was the pattern of behaviour that had emerged in the wake of that Christmas night. Certain villagers had become markedly more guarded in their speech. Others displayed an unusual defensiveness when the subject of charitable contributions arose, even tangentially. Polite exchanges that should have flowed with the ease of long familiarity now seemed to require more effort, as if each participant were navigating around obstacles visible only to themselves. He encountered Mr. Pike one morning outside the post office, that nexus of village communication where paths crossed and information, official and otherwise, changed hands. Mr. Pike was a man of substantial means and equally substantial self-regard, who had retired from business in the city with the comfortable belief that his success proved both his virtue and his wisdom. He possessed that particular form of generosity which ensures that no gift goes unacknowledged and no kindness unrecorded. Their conversation began with the customary pleasantries regarding weather and health, those safe harbours to which English discourse retreats when uncertain of its welcome in deeper waters. Yet when Mr. Rowley mentioned, with deliberate casualness, the unfortunate confusion regarding the donor list, Mr. Pike's response struck him as oddly theatrical. The man protested, with more vigour than the comment warranted, that he placed no importance whatsoever upon public recognition of his charitable acts. He insisted, from the pure impulse of Christian duty, without thought of earthly reward or social advancement. This declaration of disinterested virtue he delivered with such emphasis and at such length that Mr. Rowley found himself wondering whether Mr. Pike was attempting to convince his listener or himself. A similar encounter with Miss Clara Dewhurst proved equally illuminating in its evasions. Miss Dewhurst was a woman of middle years and modest circumstances who had devoted considerable energy to the improvement of the village through various charitable endeavours. She possessed a sharp mind and a sharper tongue, both of which she employed with discrimination and occasional devastating effect. When Mr. Rowley inquired, in the most general terms, about her recollections of the fund's establishment, she responded with uncharacteristic vagueness. The details she suggested were no longer fresh in her memory. So much time had passed. So many other matters had occupied her attention since. Surely it was all adequately documented. She spoke with the hurried air of one who wishes to conclude an interview and depart for urgent business elsewhere, though Miss Rowley observed that her urgent business consisted of walking rapidly in no particular direction. Even Mrs. Henscombe, whose social confidence usually manifested as voluble hospitality, seemed altered in subtle ways. When Mr. Rowley called upon her, ostensibly to deliver a book he had borrowed, She received him with her customary graciousness, yet steered the conversation away from any topic that might approach the question of the charitable fund. Her drawing room, usually a forum for frank discussion of village affairs, had become a stage for the performance of studied unconcern. Through these various encounters, fragments of information emerged like pieces of a puzzle scattered across a table. Someone mentioned a contribution made anonymously years earlier, though the details remained frustratingly imprecise. Another recalled a disagreement about how donors should be acknowledged, a dispute that had been resolved through compromise, or so everyone had believed at the time. A third remembered that a certain person's generosity had been accepted readily enough when offered, but never quite given its due recognition afterward. These fragments were gentle, ambiguous, weighted with emotion rather than fact. They suggested complications that had been smoothed over rather than resolved. Compromises made for the sake of harmony that perhaps had left some parties less satisfied than others. Yet no one could point to any specific injustice, any clear wrongdoing, any villain who might be held accountable. What emerged most clearly from these days of careful conversation and courteous evasion was not a solution to the mystery of the missing list, but rather a deepening appreciation of how thoroughly the village had invested in maintaining appearances. The surface of life in Larkspur End had been polished to such brightness that what lay beneath had become almost invisible, even to those who lived there. Mr. Rowley returned home each evening with his thoughts in greater disorder than when he had set forth. He was beginning to understand that the question was not simply why the list had been withdrawn, but why its absence had disturbed the peace so thoroughly. Something had been revealed on Christmas night, though what exactly remained unclear, and the village, in its collective discomfort, was discovering that some cracks, once opened, cannot easily be closed again. Chapter 34. Questions wrapped in kindness. Mr. Edmund Rowley had not intended to become an investigator of village mysteries. His retirement had been undertaken with the expectation of quiet pursuits, the cultivation of a modest garden, the reading of volumes too lengthy for professional life, and the enjoyment of that particular form of idleness which is the earned privilege of those who have laboured long and conscientiously. Yet he found himself unable to dismiss the matter of the missing donor list with the philosophical shrug that wisdom might have recommended. It was not curiosity alone that motivated him, though he possessed a share of that quality which makes retirement either tolerable or tedious depending upon how it is directed. Rather, it was a concern that something valuable was being damaged in Larkspur End, something more significant than the accuracy of a charitable record. The village's capacity for harmony, for mutual goodwill, for that comfortable trust which allows neighbours to live peaceably together. All this seemed to him to be suffering small wounds that might, if left untended, grow into something more serious. He resolved, therefore, to make discreet inquiries, framing his interest as concern for communal understanding rather than personal inquisitiveness. This was not deception precisely, for his concern was genuine. It was merely a matter of presenting his motives in terms most likely to encourage cooperation, a skill he had refined during decades of legal practice. His first formal call was upon Mrs. Henscombe, whose position in village society and evident connection to the charitable fund made her a natural source of information. He arrived at her home in the late morning, a time chosen to suggest casualness rather than official business, and was received in her drawing room with the warm efficiency she brought to all social occasions. The room itself was a testament to her principles of domestic management. Every surface bore evidence of careful arrangement. The cushions on the settee had been plumped to exact uniformity. The ornaments on the mantelpiece stood at measured intervals. Even the flowers in their vase seemed to have been instructed in the proper angle at which to display their blooms. Mrs. Henscombe offered tea with the confidence of one who knows her tea to be excellent and her service irreproachable. As she poured, Mr. Rowley introduced the subject with studied indirection, remarking upon the success of the Christmas gathering and the general spirit of charitable feeling it had demonstrated. She responded with enthusiasm, detailing the various contributions of food and the evident enjoyment of the attendees. Yet when Mr. Rowley ventured to mention the unfortunate confusion regarding the donor list, her manner altered in ways so subtle that only an observer of his experience would have noted them. Her smile remained in place, but it seemed to require marginally more effort. Her voice maintained its pleasant tone, but the words came with slightly less fluency. She recalled, she said, that there had been some disagreement years ago about the proper recognition of donors. The fund itself had been established during a period of particular need in the village, when several families had fallen upon hard times through no fault of their own. Various persons had contributed according to their means and inclinations. The question had arisen of how such generosity should be acknowledged. Some had favoured complete transparency, arguing that recognition encouraged further giving and that those who gave deserved public appreciation. Others had preferred discretion, either from modesty or from the belief that charity performed for earthly recognition lost something of its spiritual merit. A compromise had been reached, or so she had understood at the time, though the precise terms of that compromise now seemed less clear in her recollection than they once had been. Mr. Rowley listened with the attention of one gathering, not merely facts, but the spaces between facts, those telling silences and hesitations which often communicate more than deliberate statements. He asked with gentle persistence whether she recalled who had advocated most strongly for each position. Mrs. Henscombe's response was guarded. She remembered discussions, certainly, but the participants and their precise arguments had become blurred in memory. So many years had passed. So many other matters had occupied attention since. She was certain, however, that all had been resolved to general satisfaction, for otherwise surely there would have been continued discord, and she had observed none. Mr. Rowley thanked her for her time and her excellent tea, and departed with the impression that Mrs. Henscombe knew considerably more than she had disclosed, and that her reasons for discretion were complex, not entirely comfortable. His next interview was with the Reverend Julian Frost, whom he encountered by arrangement in the vestry of the church. The Reverend received him with evident pleasure, for he was a man who enjoyed company and conversation, particularly when those conversations allowed him to speak at length about matters he considered important. The vestry was a small room, rendered smaller by the accumulation of objects deemed necessary for ecclesiastical administration. Registers, hymnals, and various papers occupied every horizontal surface. A faint smell of candle wax and old paper hung in the air. The Reverend gestured Mr. Rowley to a chair, whose cushion had been compressed by years of clerical meditation into a shape of dubious comfort. When Mr. Rowley raised the subject of the charitable fund and the question of donor recognition, the Reverend's face assumed an expression of earnest recollection. He remembered the matter, certainly. He had been consulted at the time, as was natural given his position. His advice, he believed, had been instrumental in reaching a resolution that honoured both the spirit of charity and the sensibilities of the various parties involved. He had counselled, he explained with evident satisfaction in his own wisdom, that discretion was the better part of valour in such matters. Some donors wished recognition, and that was entirely understandable and proper. Others preferred anonymity, and that too deserved respect. The solution he had suggested was to acknowledge contributions in general terms while allowing individuals to determine the extent of their public connection to the gift. This formulation, he assured Mr. Rowley, had pleased everyone at the time, or at least he corrected himself with less certainty. It had displeased no one sufficiently to voice objection, which amounted to the same thing, did it not? Mr. Vaughan Rowley, drawing upon reserves of patience cultivated through years of listening to witnesses whose certainty was inversely proportional to their accuracy, asked whether the Reverend recalled any particular individual who had expressed strong feelings about remaining anonymous. The Reverend's face clouded slightly. There had been someone, he thought, or perhaps more than one. The details had not seemed important at the time, and he had not committed them to memory with the precision that in retrospect might have been prudent. His role had been to ensure harmony, not to maintain records. That was Mr. Brooke's responsibility, and Mr. Brooke was nothing if not meticulous. At the mention of Mr. Brooke, Mr. Rowley felt a small spark of recognition, as when a person lost in fog suddenly glimpses a familiar landmark. He thanked the Reverend and took his leave, his mind turning toward the quiet parish clerk whose efficiency had been so evident on Christmas night, and whose involvement in the matter now seemed less peripheral than it had initially appeared. As he walked back through the village, Mr. Rowley reflected that he had learned little in the way of concrete fact, yet much about the emotional landscape surrounding the missing list. There had been compromise, certainly, there had been disagreement, managed rather than resolved, and there had been Minna Brooke, present at every turn, helpful and unobtrusive and remarkably well informed. The question was beginning to shift in Mr. Rowley's mind from what had happened to why it mattered so much now, and why the village seemed so determined to avoid answering either question directly. Chapter 5. The Comfort of Being Misunderstood. There exists in human nature a curious tendency to prefer comfortable explanations over accurate ones, particularly when accuracy threatens to disturb settled opinions or require uncomfortable reassessments of persons and situations. Larkspur End, in the days following Mr. Rowley's quiet inquiries, demonstrated this tendency with remarkable consistency. The village, having been presented with a mystery, set about solving it in ways that confirmed existing prejudices and preserved established hierarchies. This was not accomplished through conscious conspiracy or deliberate malice, but through that more insidious process by which communities maintain their equilibrium, the collective agreement to believe what is most convenient. Mr. Leonard Pike emerged in certain conversations as a figure of particular interest, though those who spoke of him did so with the careful ambiguity that allows for retreat should the speculation prove unfounded. Mr. Pike was noted, had always been conspicuous in his charity. His name appeared on subscription lists with the regularity of seasons. His contributions to village improvements were both generous and well documented. Yet this very prominence invited a kind of sceptical arithmetic. Mrs. Cutler, while arranging bread in her shop window, remarked to a customer that it was curious how Mr. Pike's generosity seemed always to match precisely the amount required to place his name in positions of maximum visibility. Not that she doubted his genuine charitable impulses, she hastened to add, but merely observed that virtue and vanity might sometimes arrive at the same destination by different routes. This observation, once planted, grew with the vigour of a weed in fertile soil. Others recalled instances where Mr. Pike had inquired with unnecessary frequency about how donor lists would be arranged, or had suggested with suspicious casualness that alphabetical ordering might be reconsidered in favour of arrangements by contribution size. These recollections, whether entirely accurate or subtly enhanced by retrospective interpretation, accumulated into a portrait of a man whose charity might not be quite as disinterested as his public statements suggested. Mr. Pike himself, unaware of these circulating theories, continued his daily routines with undiminished self-satisfaction. He took his morning constitutional with the bearing of one who expects to be admired by passers-by. He conducted his business at the bank and post office with the confident manner of man whose position in society is both earned and secure. Had he known that his name was being connected, however tentatively, with the mystery of the missing list, he would have been first astonished and then indignant, for his self-conception admitted no possibility of impropriety. Miss Clara Dewhurst presented quite a different case, yet she too became subject to speculation of a sort that revealed more about the speculators than about herself. Miss Dewhurst had indeed been instrumental in organising the charitable fund years earlier, a fact acknowledged by all, yet her current reluctance to discuss that effort struck some as suspicious. Mr. Finch, the apothecary, mentioned to his wife that it was remarkable how persons who had once taken credit for organising charity sometimes became silent when questions of recognition arose. His wife, a woman of sharper insight than her husband generally credited, suggested that perhaps Miss Dewhurst had reasons for discretion that had nothing to do with guilt. This possibility Mr. Finch acknowledged with the vague murmur of one who has already settled upon a more dramatic conclusion and is not inclined to be disturbed by alternatives. The truth, had anyone thought to inquire directly of Miss Dewhurst, was both simpler and more complicated than the theories suggested. She had organised the fund with genuine dedication and had done so at a time of personal difficulty, when her own circumstances were less secure than they later became. The effort had cost her considerable time and emotional energy. Yet she had learned, through experiences both before and after that undertaking, that those who involve themselves in village affairs often find themselves blamed for complications they did not create and credited for successes they did not solely achieve. Her silence on the subject now stemmed not from concealment of wrongdoing, but from a weary desire to avoid the inevitable misrepresentations that attend charitable work. Mrs. Henscombe, meanwhile, occupied a position of particular complexity in the village imagination. Her social standing had certainly benefited from the fund's success. The charitable efforts she had supported had enhanced her reputation as a woman of refined sensibility and generous spirit. Whether this enhancement was calculated or incidental remained a subject of debate conducted entirely through implication and raised eyebrows. What no one quite dared to say directly, but what several persons thought privately, was that Mrs. Henscombe's investment in maintaining appearances might make her particularly sensitive to anything that threatened those appearances. If the missing donor list contained information that complicated the narrative of harmonious village charity, might she not have an interest in seeing it remain hidden? This theory possessed a pleasing symmetry and a satisfying assignment of motivation to someone of sufficient social importance to make the speculation feel significant. Yet it suffered from the disadvantage of having no particular evidence to support it beyond the general observation that Mrs. Henscombe cared about her reputation, which could be said of most persons in possession of one. Mr. Rowley, continuing his observations, noted these various theories with interest and concern. He recognised in them the familiar human impulse to resolve uncertainty through creation of narratives that feel true even when unsupported by fact. Each theory found ready acceptance among those whose existing opinions it confirmed. Each allowed the theorist to feel perceptive while avoiding the discomfort of genuine inquiry. What struck him most forcefully was how these comfortable explanations protected the village from confronting possibilities more disturbing than individual vanity or social ambition. If Mr. Pike was vain, if Miss Dewhurst was secretive, if Mrs. Henscombe was self-interested, then the mystery could be understood as a small drama of personal failings. The village itself, its systems and assumptions, could remain unexamined. Yet Mr. Rowley sensed that the truth lay elsewhere, in territory less flattering to collective self-regard. The missing list was not absent because of one person's misconduct, but because of choices made by many, compromises accepted for convenience, and truths deemed better left unstated for the sake of harmony. He thought again of Mr. Brooke, the quiet parish clerk who appeared in every account yet, whose role remained curiously undefined. The man was helpful, certainly, efficient, undoubtedly. But Mr. Rowley had practised law long enough to know that the most important actors in any drama are often those who seem merely to be keeping the machinery running smoothly. As the first week of the new year drew to a close, Larkspur End settled into its various theories with visible relief. The mystery had been domesticated, rendered comprehensible through familiar categories of human weakness. Conversations turned to other matters. Life resumed its accustomed patterns. Yet for Mr. Rowley, and perhaps for a few others whose thoughts ran in less comfortable channels, the question remained open. The village had found explanations that allowed it to feel wise without being honest. And truth, he suspected, was waiting with the patience of something inevitable for its opportunity to speak. Chapter 6. What Looked Like the Truth. The church registry was kept in a cabinet of dark oak that stood in the vestry like a sentinel guarding secrets of births, marriages, and deaths. Among these solemn records, maintained with the precision that law and custom demanded, there resided also various documents pertaining to parish business, subscriptions, and charitable endeavours. It was to these latter papers that Mr. Rowley directed his attention on a grey morning in early January, having obtained the Reverend's permission to examine them under the pretext of satisfying historical curiosity about village philanthropy. The Reverend had granted this permission with the distracted cheerfulness of a man who cannot imagine what harm might come from reviewing old papers, and who is, in any case, too occupied with present concerns to trouble himself about past ones. He suggested that Mr. Brooke might be summoned to assist, for the parish clerk knew the location and nature of every document with the familiarity of long custodianship. Mr. Rowley, however, declined this offer with gentle insistence, preferring to conduct his examination in solitude. The documents themselves were arranged with exemplary order, each folder labelled in a hand so consistent and precise that it might have been produced by a printing press rather than a human being. Mr. Rowley recognised the penmanship as Mr. Brooke's, that same careful script which had adorned the parish registers and numerous other official records. The man's dedication to his duties was evident in every carefully formed letter. Mr. Rowley began with the most recent records and worked backward through time, his practised eye noting dates, amounts and names with the attention to detail that had served him well in legal practice. The charitable fund in question had been established 7 years previous, during a particularly harsh winter when several village families had found themselves in circumstances of genuine distress. The initial subscriptions had been substantial, reflecting both the urgency of need and the community's response to it. As he examined the records more closely, however, small inconsistencies began to emerge. They were subtle, the sort of discrepancies that might escape casual notice, but which to an observer of Mr. Rowley's experience suggested careful rather than careless management. A date here had been altered, the original notation visible beneath a neat correction. A contribution there had been recorded initially under one heading and later transferred to another. Acknowledgements of certain donations had been delayed by weeks or months, the reasons for delay not specified. None of these irregularities suggested dishonesty in the vulgar sense of theft or misappropriation. The funds had clearly been used for their intended purpose, and the amounts recorded corresponded with reasonable accuracy to the relief provided. Yet the pattern suggested something more complex, a systematic effort to obscure the source of certain contributions while ensuring their effect remained visible. One folder in particular drew Mr. Rowley's attention. It contained correspondence related to the fund's establishment, including letters from various potential donors and notes regarding the organisation of the relief effort. Among these papers was a letter whose tone struck him as significant, though its content was frustratingly incomplete. The letter, written in a hand quite different from Mr. Brooke's meticulous script, expressed willingness to contribute a substantial sum toward the relief of distressed families. However, it stipulated certain conditions. The contribution was to be made anonymously. No public acknowledgement was to be given. The donor's identity was to be known only to those directly responsible for administering the fund, and even they were enjoined to treat this information as a confidence not to be disclosed. The letter was unsigned, or rather the signature had been removed with such care that not even the indentation of the pen remained visible on the paper. Yet certain phrases within it suggested education, refinement, and a concern for propriety that went beyond a mere modesty. This was not someone avoiding recognition out of false humility or seeking to dramatize their generosity through theatrical secrecy. This was someone with genuine reasons for remaining unidentified. Mr. Rowley sat back in his chair, the letter still in his hand, and considered what he had discovered. Here was evidence of intentional concealment, but concealment of a sort that suggested protection rather than deception. Someone had wished to give substantially without being known. Mr. Brooke, as administrator of the fund, had honoured that wish with scrupulous care, even to the point of altering records to ensure that the donor's identity remained obscure. The question that now presented itself was not whether Mr. Brooke had acted improperly, but rather why such extraordinary measures had been necessary, and why they continued to be maintained years after the immediate crisis had passed. He was interrupted in these reflections by the arrival of Mr. Brooke himself, who entered the vestry with his customary quiet efficiency. The parish clerk showed no surprise at finding Mr. Rowley among the documents, though his eyes moved briefly to the papers spread across the table before returning to the visitor's face. "I trust you are finding what you seek," Mr. Brooke said, his voice carrying neither challenge nor concern, merely the mild inquiry of one responsible for the orderly maintenance of records. Mr. Rowley, recognizing an opportunity for direct conversation, gestured to the chair opposite his own. "I find myself discovering more questions than answers," he said. "Perhaps you might assist me in understanding certain matters that are not entirely clear from the written record alone." Mr. Brooke seated himself with the careful precision he brought to all actions. His face maintained its habitual expression of attentive calm, yet Mr. Rowley, watching closely, detected a slight tension in the set of his shoulders, as if the man were preparing himself for an examination he had long anticipated. "The charitable fund," Mr. Rowley began, keeping his tone conversational rather than accusatory, "was established with contributions from various sources. It appears that some of those contributions were acknowledged publicly while others were deliberately obscured. Might you explain the reasoning behind this distinction?" Mr. Brooke was silent for a moment, his gaze fixed on his own hands where they rested, folded, upon the table. When he spoke, his voice carried the measured quality of one who has considered his words carefully and chosen them with precision. "I followed instructions," he said simply. "It was my duty to administer the fund according to the wishes of those who contributed to it. Some wished recognition, which was their right. Others preferred privacy, which was equally their right. I sought merely to honour both preferences as faithfully as I could." "And the missing donor list?" Mr. Rowley asked gently. "The one withdrawn on Christmas night?" "An old promise," Mr. Brooke replied, his eyes meeting Mr. Rowley's now with quiet steadiness. "Given long ago and never rescinded, I judged it better to maintain that confidence than to risk violating it for the sake of contemporary convenience." The answer was honest, Mr. Rowley sensed, yet incomplete. There was more to the story, layers of context and consequence that remained unspoken. Yet he could see also that Mr. Brooke would not be pressed beyond his sense of what was proper to reveal. The man's loyalty to his responsibilities was absolute, even when that loyalty brought him under suspicion. Mr. Rowley gathered the papers slowly, returning them to their folders with care. "I believe," he said, "that this matter involves not deception but discretion. Yet discretion prolonged beyond its purpose can itself become a kind of falsehood, can it not?" Mr. Brooke inclined his head slightly, acknowledgment without quite agreement. "Perhaps," he said. "Yet some truths, once revealed, cannot be concealed again. One must be certain that revelation serves justice rather than merely satisfying curiosity." It was as close to a confession of deeper knowledge as Mr. Rowley suspected he would receive at this moment. The truth was present in the room, hovering just beyond articulation, waiting for circumstances that would make its full disclosure both necessary and just. Those circumstances, Mr. Rowley sensed, were approaching, but they had not yet arrived. Chapter 7. The Shape Beneath the Surface. Truth, when it finally emerges after long concealment, often arrives not through dramatic revelation, but through the patient assembly of fragments into a coherent whole, much as a picture gradually becomes visible when one steps back from individual brushstrokes to perceive the entire canvas. So it was that Mr. Rowley, through conversations held and observations made over the course of several days, began to discern the shape of a story that had been present in Larkspur End all along, hidden not through elaborate deception, but through the simple expedient of never speaking of it directly. The story, as it revealed itself to him, began 7 years previous during that severe winter, which older residents still recalled with involuntary shudders. The cold had been exceptional, the sort that penetrates stone walls and finds every gap in window frames. For families of comfortable means, such weather meant inconvenience and additional expense. For those whose circumstances were more precarious, it meant genuine crisis. Among the families thus affected had been the Ashfords, a name that Mr. Rowley recognised as belonging to the same Miss Ashford, who now kept a small shop selling ribbons and notions on the high street. 7 years ago, however, the Ashfords had occupied quite a different position in village life. Miss Ashford's father had been a respected tradesman whose business, through a combination of unfortunate investments and the machinations of a dishonest partner, had collapsed with suddenness that left the family not merely reduced in circumstances, but facing genuine destitution. The shame of such a fall, in a community where respectability was measured in precise gradations and closely watched, had been severe. Mr. Ashford himself had retreated into silence and decline, his health failing under the weight of humiliation as much as hardship. Mrs. Ashford had struggled to maintain appearances while confronting the practical impossibilities of their situation. Miss Ashford, then barely 20, had watched her family's standing crumble while facing the prospect of a future constrained by poverty and damaged reputation. It was at this juncture Mr. Rowley learned, through careful inquiry directed to those old enough to remember and willing to speak, that an extraordinary act of generosity had occurred. An individual whose identity was never publicly revealed had provided the means not merely for the Ashfords' immediate survival, but for their gradual restoration to modest independence. The contribution had been substantial enough to settle debts, secure lodging, and eventually enable Miss Ashford to establish her small business. This generosity had been extended with one absolute condition: that no acknowledgement be made, no gratitude expressed publicly, and no effort undertaken to discover the benefactor's identity. The gift was to be accepted as one might accept Providence, as a fact rather than a transaction requiring reciprocal obligation. Mr. Brooke, then a young man newly appointed to his position as parish clerk, had been entrusted with the administration of this arrangement. He had ensured that funds reached the Ashfords through channels that obscured their origin. He had maintained records that documented the relief provided, while protecting the donor's anonymity, and he had kept this confidence with absolute fidelity through all the years that followed. But the Ashfords had not been the only beneficiaries of that hidden generosity. Mr. Rowley discovered, through patient reconstruction of events, that several other families had received assistance during that same period, all administered through the charitable fund, but all traceable, when examined with sufficient care, to the same anonymous source. The elderly Pembertons, whose situation had been desperate after Mr. Pemberton's injury in a coaching accident, the widow Hartley and her 3 small children left, without resources after her husband's sudden death. Each had been supported through crisis, enabled to maintain dignity, and gradually restored to self-sufficiency. What made these acts of charity remarkable was not merely their scale, but their character. The assistance had been given in ways that minimized humiliation and preserved the recipient's sense of agency. Funds had been provided as though they were the natural workings of communal support rather than individual patronage. No one was made to feel like an object of pity or obligated to perform gratitude. The gift came without the burden of debt, yet this very discretion had created a peculiar situation. The village as a whole took credit for its charitable spirit, congratulating itself on communal generosity that was, in fact, largely the work of one unknown person. Others who had contributed more modest sums found their names recorded and praised. Those who had given generously but publicly received recognition proportionate to their gifts. Only the one whose contribution had been greatest remained invisible, which was precisely as that person had wished. Mr. Rowley, sitting in his study as evening drew in and contemplating what he had learned, found himself moved by the elegance of this concealment. The donor had achieved something rare, the performance of genuine charity, uncontaminated by the desire for recognition or the subtle power that comes from creating obligation. Yet in doing so, that person had also created a situation where others received credit deserved elsewhere, and where the true shape of village life remained obscured. The question that presented itself now was whether this arrangement, however well-intentioned in its origins, had been sustained beyond its proper term. The families who had been helped had long since recovered their independence. The crisis that had prompted the extraordinary generosity had passed into history. Yet the secret remained kept, the donor still unnamed, and the village still operating under assumptions about its own character that were not entirely accurate. Mr. Rowley understood now why Mr. Brooke had withdrawn the donor list on Christmas night. To display it would have meant either violating the promise of anonymity or creating a conspicuous absence that would itself constitute revelation. The parish clerk had found himself caught between competing obligations, the duty to honour an old confidence and the duty to maintain accurate public records. What Mr. Rowley did not yet know, and what seemed crucial to understanding the full significance of the matter, was the identity of the donor and the reason for such determined anonymity. Modesty alone seemed insufficient explanation for such elaborate concealment. There must have been additional considerations, personal or social, that made invisibility not merely preferable but necessary. He thought of the various figures in the village life who might possess both the means and the motivation for such charity. Mrs. Henscombe had resources, certainly, but her investment in social recognition made such secrecy seem uncharacteristic. Mr. Pike had means but lacked, or so it seemed, the delicacy of feeling that would express itself in this particular form. Others of comfortable circumstance had contributed to the fund, but, in ordinary ways, their generosity neither concealed nor exceptional. The answer, he suspected, lay in some configuration of circumstances he had not yet considered, some intersection of capability, motivation, and necessity that would make the pattern of actions comprehensible. The truth was near now, close enough that he could sense its presence without quite perceiving its shape. In the darkness outside his window, Larkspur End settled into its evening routines. Lamps were lit in windows, doors were closed against the cold. The village presented its familiar aspect of order and quietude, yet beneath that surface connections existed that few suspected, debts of gratitude unacknowledged, and kindnesses that had shaped lives while remaining forever unnamed. The time was approaching, Mr. Rowley sensed, when those hidden connections would need to be brought into light, not for the satisfaction of curiosity, but for the sake of truth itself. Chapter 8. Kind Acts Remembered Late. There are moments in the course of human inquiry when understanding arrives not through the discovery of new information, but through the rearrangement of facts already known into a pattern previously unseen. Such a moment came to Mr. Rowley on a morning of pale winter sunshine, as he sat in his study reviewing notes he had made over the preceding days. He had been considering again the question of who in Larkspur End might possess both the means to provide such substantial charity and the reasons to insist upon absolute anonymity. His thoughts had circled repeatedly through the obvious candidates, finding each wanting in some essential particular. Yet as he gazed at the list of families who had been helped, a different question presented itself. Not who had the most to give, but who had the most to protect. The Ashfords had been saved from disgrace. The Pembertons had been rescued from destitution. The Hartley family had been preserved from separation and workhouse. Each family had not merely survived their crisis, but had been enabled to maintain their place in village society with dignity and tact. This was not the charity of surplus distributed casually, but the charity of one who understood intimately what it meant to face ruin and who wished to spare others that particular form of suffering. Understanding came to him then with the quiet certainty of truth recognized. The donor had not been someone standing above the crisis, distributing largesse from a position of unassailable security. The donor had been someone touched by the same circumstances, someone whose own position was precarious enough that public revelation of their generosity might have invited questions about resources, priorities, or propriety that they could not afford to answer. He thought of Miss Clara Dewhurst, who had organised the charitable fund with such dedication and who had subsequently refused to discuss it. He thought of her current modest but secure circumstances, of the small income she derived from investments wisely made and carefully husbanded. He thought of her reluctance to revisit matters from 7 years past, a reluctance he had attributed to weariness or discretion, but which might equally stem from the fear of exposure. 7 years ago, Miss Dewhurst's situation had been quite different. She had not yet inherited the small legacy from a distant aunt that had secured her independence. She had been living in genteel poverty, maintaining appearances through the strict economy that single women of limited means must practice. Yet she had possessed one asset of considerable value, a small property in the next county, inherited from her parents and held as security against an uncertain future. What if, Mr. Rowley asked himself, Miss Dewhurst had sold that property quietly, and directed the proceeds not to her own comfort, but to the relief of families whose distress was more immediate than her own? What if she had chosen to make herself permanently dependent on modest investments, rather than see her neighbours destroyed by circumstances similar to those that threatened her own position? Such an action would explain the insistence on anonymity. A woman in her situation, giving away her only substantial asset, would have invited speculation about her judgment, her prospects, and her suitability to manage her own affairs. The very generosity that would appear admirable in a man of established means might, in her case, be interpreted as imprudence or even instability. Better to remain invisible than to risk the condescension of those who could not understand choosing the welfare of others over personal security. It would explain too her involvement in organising the fund itself. She could ensure that her contribution was properly administered, while maintaining the fiction that she was merely facilitating the generosity of others. Mr. Sutter Brooke, trusted with the secret, would have helped maintain this arrangement, his meticulous record-keeping serving to obscure rather than reveal the true source of the fund's substance. Mr. Rowley sat back in his chair, feeling the weight of this recognition settle upon him. If his understanding was correct, then the village's assumption about its own collective generosity was built upon the extraordinary sacrifice of one woman who had chosen to impoverish herself rather than see others suffer. And that same village, in its comfortable theories about vanity and self-interest, had been ready to suspect everyone except the person whose modesty was most genuine because it was most necessary. He decided that confirmation, if it could be obtained, should come directly from the one person who certainly knew the truth. That afternoon he called upon Mr. Brooke at the small cottage near the church that served as the parish clerk's residence. Mr. Brooke received him with his customary courtesy, showing him into a sitting room whose furnishings spoke of comfort without ostentation. A fire burned in the grate, its warmth welcome after the cold of the walk. The room bore evidence of its occupant's orderly nature. Books arranged by size, papers stacked with geometric precision, even the coal in its scuttle seeming to have been placed with deliberate care. Mr. Rowley came directly to his purpose. "I believe I have discerned the identity of the anonymous donor," he said. "I wish neither to violate confidence nor to create difficulty. Yet I think the time has come when truth serves justice better than continued concealment. Will you tell me if I am correct in believing that Miss Clara Dewhurst was the source of the charitable fund's principal resources?" Mr. Brooke regarded him steadily, his face revealing the internal struggle between loyalty to an old promise and recognition that circumstances had changed. Finally, he spoke with quiet deliberation. "You understand that I cannot confirm such a thing without Miss Dewhurst's permission. The confidence was given to me, not to be kept until convenient to break, but to be maintained until its keeper was released from obligation." "I understand," Mr. Rowley said. "Yet consider this. The decision to withdraw the donor list on Christmas night was yours, made without consultation because you judged it the right action. Might not circumstances now call for another independent judgment? The village has been troubled by mysteries and suspicions. Miss Dewhurst herself has been subject to speculation. Truth might serve all parties better than continued concealment." Mr. Brooke rose and moved to the window, gazing out at the church whose records he maintained with such fidelity. When he turned back, his expression had softened into something approaching relief. "Miss Dewhurst made her gift," he said carefully, "at a time when her own circumstances were uncertain. She sold property that represented her security to provide for families whose need was immediate. She asked only that this remain unknown, fearing that recognition would bring judgment rather than gratitude. I have honoured that request because I believed it just to do so." "And the missing donor list," Mr. Rowley asked gently, "was to include all names of contributors, including, by oversight or policy change, one that should have remained absent. I could not allow it to be displayed, for it would have been a betrayal of everything Miss Dewhurst's gift represented. Better to appear incompetent or evasive than to violate a trust given in good faith." The confirmation, though indirect, was complete. Mr. Rowley felt the satisfaction of understanding joined with a profound respect for both the giver and the guardian of her secret. "What would you have me do with this knowledge, Mr. Brooke asked, and in his voice was genuine uncertainty, the question of a man who had borne responsibility alone and now found it unexpectedly shared. "With your permission," Mr. Rowley said, "I would speak with Miss Dewhurst herself, not to expose her against her will, but to suggest that the time for silence may have passed. The village deserves to know the truth of its own history, and Miss Dewhurst deserves to be understood rather than suspected." Mr. Brooke nodded slowly. "I will call upon her this evening and inform her of your discovery. If she consents to speak with you, I will send word. The decision must be hers." Mr. Rowley took his leave, walking back through the village with new understanding of the ground beneath his feet. How many conversations, how many acts of daily commerce, how many assumptions about prosperity and position rested upon foundations laid by Miss Dewhurst's quiet sacrifice? The village thought itself charitable through collective effort. The truth was both simpler and more extraordinary. One woman had given everything she could spare, and some of what she could not, to ensure that others need not suffer what she had feared for herself, and she had asked only to remain unnamed. Chapter 9. The Truth Allowed to Speak. The following evening brought a gathering in Mr. Brooke's cottage that was unprecedented in its composition if not in its setting. Present were Mr. Rowley, Miss Clara Dewhurst, Mr. Brooke himself, and the Reverend Julian Frost, who had been included at Miss Dewhurst's particular request. The fire had been built up against the January cold, and the lamps cast a warm glow that softened the austere precision of the room's arrangement into something approaching coziness. Miss Dewhurst sat with the upright posture that had become habitual to her, yet Mr. Rowley observed in her bearing not the rigidity of defensive pride, but rather the composed dignity of one who had made a decision and intended to abide by its consequences. She had dressed with her customary care, her gown modest but well maintained, her grey hair arranged with neat simplicity. She looked, Mr. Rowley thought, like a woman preparing to deliver testimony she had long known she might one day be called upon to give. Mr. Brooke, having served tea with the same meticulous attention he brought to all tasks, took his seat and regarded Miss Dewhurst with an expression that mingled concern with something approaching relief. The secret he had carried alone for 7 years was about to be shared, and the weight of sole custody was perhaps greater than he had allowed himself to acknowledge. The Reverend Frost appeared uncertain, glancing between the assembled persons with the confused attentiveness of one who senses the importance of an occasion without quite understanding its nature. He had been told only that a matter of parish concern required discussion, and his willingness to attend without demanding fuller explanation spoke well of his trust, if not of his pastoral discernment. It was Miss Dewhurst who spoke first, her voice steady and surprisingly free of either defensiveness or false modesty. "I understand, Mr. Rowley, that you have arrived at certain conclusions regarding the charitable fund established 7 years past. Mr. Brooke has informed me of your discretion in pursuing this inquiry, and of your concern for justice rather than mere curiosity. I have agreed to this conversation because I believe the time has come when truth serves better than continued concealment." Mr. Rowley inclined his head in acknowledgement. "I am honoured by your trust, Miss Dewhurst. I have no wish to cause discomfort or to violate privacy, yet I believe that understanding what truly occurred might heal divisions that have arisen through misapprehension." Miss Dewhurst allowed herself a small, rueful smile. "Divisions I had hoped to prevent through anonymity but which, it seems, I have inadvertently caused by the same means. There is an irony in that which I cannot help but note. She paused, gathering her thoughts, and when she continued, her narrative possessed the clarity of something long considered and now finally given voice 7 years ago. I found myself in circumstances that many women of limited means will recognise. I had a small income, sufficient for your modest living if managed with extreme care. I had a property inherited from my parents, which represented both security and burden, for it required maintenance I could ill afford while being too valuable to neglect. When the severe winter came and I witnessed families of my acquaintance facing ruin, I was forced to examine my own principles. I had often spoken of Christian duty and charitable obligation, yet here was an opportunity to act upon those principles in ways that would cost me dearly. I could maintain my security, or I could use it to secure others. I could not do both. The Reverend Frost leaned forward, his face showing dawning comprehension mixed with evident distress at having failed to recognise this sacrifice when it occurred. "I chose to sell the property," Miss Dewhurst continued, her tone matter of fact, despite the magnitude of what she described. The proceeds were substantial, sufficient to address the immediate crisis facing several families and to establish a fund that might prevent similar suffering in future. Yet I insisted upon an anonymity, not from false modesty, but from genuine necessity. She looked directly at Mr. Rowley now, her gaze steady. "You are an observant man, sir, and you have surely noted that the position of unmarried women of small means is precarious in ways that those of greater security sometimes fail to appreciate. Had it been known that I had sold my only substantial asset to give away the proceeds, I would have been judged not charitable but imprudent. Well-meaning persons would have questioned my fitness to manage my own affairs. I might have found myself subject to protections I did not desire and controls I could not accept." "And so you chose invisibility," Mr. Rowley said gently, "as the only means by which you could act according to your conscience, without sacrificing your independence." "Precisely," Miss Dewhurst confirmed. "Mr. Brooke was the only person I trusted with knowledge of the arrangement. He agreed to administer the funds while ensuring that their source remained obscure. His loyalty to that promise has been absolute, even when maintaining it brought him under suspicion of irregularity." Mr. Brooke spoke then, his voice quiet but firm. "It was my honour to serve in this capacity." Miss Dewhurst asked nothing for herself, not even the comfort of knowing that her sacrifice was recognised. To fail in protecting that anonymity would have been to fail in the only duty that truly mattered. The Reverend Frost found his voice at last, though it trembled slightly with emotion. "My dear Miss Dewhurst, I am mortified to realise that such extraordinary charity occurred within my parish without my knowledge. Had I been more observant, more attentive to the true character of my parishioners, rather than to the smooth conduct of services, you served as you believed best, Reverend," Miss Dewhurst interrupted with gentle firmness, "and the families who were helped effectively, which was my only concern. What troubles me now is not that the secret was kept, but that its keeping has caused confusion and suspicion. Mr. Rowley has suggested that revelation might serve healing. I am willing to accept that judgment, though I confess to some trepidation about how such revelation will be received." Mr. Rowley considered his words carefully before responding. "The village has been operating under certain assumptions about its own character and history. Those assumptions are not entirely accurate, yet they are not entirely false either. The charitable spirit exists in Larkspur End, but its most significant expression came from one individual rather than from collective effort. To reveal this is not to diminish others, but to honour truth." "And what of those who contributed more modestly, Miss Dewhurst asked. "Their gifts were real and given, with good intention. I have no desire to make them appear miserly, by comparison with my own larger contribution." "Every gift given with genuine charity has its own worth," the Reverend said, finding his pastoral voice at last. "Yet there is no dishonour in acknowledging that some sacrifices are greater than others. Indeed, Scripture itself makes this distinction." The conversation continued as the evening deepened, moving from task or revelation to consideration of how that revelation should be shared with the broader community. It was agreed that the truth should be told plainly, but without dramatics, presented as a matter of historical correction rather than moral judgment. Those who had been helped by Miss Dewhurst's generosity should be informed privately first, given the opportunity to express their gratitude if they wished. As the gathering prepared to conclude, Miss Dewhurst spoke once more, her voice thoughtful. I wonder if the true lesson of this matter is not about charity at all, but about the distance between appearance and reality. Larkspur End believed itself to be one sort of place, built upon one sort of foundation. The truth is both simpler and more complex than that comfortable belief allowed. Mr. Rowley nodded slowly. Perhaps every community lives partly upon such comfortable fictions. The question is whether we can bear to see beneath them without losing the capacity for kindness that those fictions were meant to protect. We shall discover the answer soon enough, Miss Dewhurst replied, with a smile that held both courage and resignation. The meeting adjourned with mutual understanding that the coming days would bring change to Larkspur End. Whether that change would prove beneficial or burdensome remained to be seen. But the truth, having been finally allowed to speak, could not easily be silenced again. Chapter 10, When the Surface Held Again. The revelation of Miss Dewhurst's generosity moved through Larkspur End not with the explosive force of scandal, but with the quiet pervasiveness of snow falling steadily through a winter night. By the time most villagers learned of it, the initial shock had been softened through careful preparation, the truth presented not as accusation of those who had misunderstood, but as completion of a story that had remained unfinished. The Reverend Frost announced the matter from the pulpit on the Sunday, following that evening gathering, his sermon taking as its text the passage about charity performed in secret and rewarded openly. He spoke with evident feeling of Miss Dewhurst's sacrifice, of Mr. Brooke's faithful stewardship, and of the village's collective responsibility to honour truth even when truth proved uncomfortable. His delivery lacked its usual tendency toward platitude, for he was speaking of actual persons and actual events rather than abstract principles, and the difference showed in both his words and his manner. The congregation received this information with a silence that was at first stunned and then thoughtful. Eyes turned toward Miss Dewhurst, who sat in her customary pew with composed dignity, neither shrinking from attention nor inviting it. Eyes turned also toward Mr. Brooke, whose habitual modesty now appeared in a different light, not as self-effacement, but as the proper discretion of one entrusted with significant confidence. In the days that followed, the village experienced a period of readjustment as its understanding of itself and its history underwent necessary revision. This process was not without difficulty. Mr. Leonard Pike, learning that his prominently displayed generosity had been far exceeded by Miss Dewhurst's hidden sacrifice, struggled briefly with embarrassment before arriving at a creditable grace. He called upon Miss Dewhurst to express admiration for her charity and to acknowledge that his own contributions, while sincere, had been made with considerably less cost to himself. The interview was brief but genuine, and both parties emerged from it with enhanced respect for each other. The Ashford family, upon being informed privately of Miss Dewhurst's role in their rescue from ruin, responded with a depth of gratitude that moved even Mr. Rowley, who had witnessed many expressions of human emotion in his professional career. Miss Ashford wept openly, then insisted upon embracing her benefactor with a warmth that broke through the reserve both women habitually maintained. That Miss Dewhurst was herself moved became evident in the brightness of her eyes, and there was a slight tremor in her voice as she assured Miss Ashford that seeing her established in respectable independence was reward sufficient for any sacrifice. The Pembertons and the widow Hartley, similarly informed, responded with their own expressions of recognition and thanksgiving. What had been abstract, Providence revealed itself as specific human kindness, and this difference transformed both the gratitude of the recipients and their understanding of their place in the community. Mrs. Henscombe, whose social acuity had been temporarily clouded by comfortable assumptions, recovered her perceptiveness with admirable swiftness. She organised a small gathering at her home, ostensibly to celebrate the season, but transparently designed to allow the village an opportunity to demonstrate its appreciation for Miss Dewhurst without subjecting her to the ordeal of formal public recognition. The event was managed with Mrs. Henscombe's characteristic efficiency, striking that delicate balance between acknowledgement and discretion, which is the mark of genuine social intelligence. At this gathering, Miss Dewhurst found herself surrounded by persons whose lives her generosity had touched, directly or indirectly, and by others who wished simply to express respect for charity so permanent. She accepted these attentions with the grace of one who understands that some obligations cannot be avoided without giving offence, and if she found the experience somewhat trying, she bore it without complaint. Mr. Brooke, too, received recognition of a sort he had neither sought nor expected. The village came to understand that his unremarkable efficiency masked a quality of character that was anything but ordinary. His loyalty to Miss Dewhurst's confidence, maintained even under suspicion and at cost to his own reputation, spoke of integrity that mere competence could not explain. He continued in his duties as parish clerk, but he did so now with an enhanced standing that made those duties somehow less invisible than they had been. The donor list, which had been the proximate cause of all this revelation, was eventually revised and displayed in the church hall. It bore a simple notation acknowledging gifts given in trust and sacrifice made without expectation of recognition. This formulation satisfied both historical accuracy and Miss Dewhurst's continued preference for restraint, and it stood as a quiet reminder that the best of human actions are often those which seek least to advertise themselves. As January gave way to February and the first tentative suggestions of spring began to appear in lengthening days and cautious bird song, Larkspur End settled once more into its accustomed rhythms. Yet the village that emerged from this period of disruption and revelation was subtly changed from the village that had entered it. The change was not dramatic. No great reforms were instituted. No fundamental alterations in social structure occurred. Yet there existed now a deeper understanding that the polished surface of communal life rested upon foundations more complex than collective self-congratulation allowed. The village had learned that its harmony had been sustained not merely by the vague goodwill of many, but by the specific sacrifices of individuals whose names it had not troubled to learn. Mr. Rowley, reflecting on these events from the vantage of his study, found himself satisfied with the resolution while remaining conscious of its limitations. The truth had been revealed, and justice of a sort had been achieved. Yet he recognised that every community must live with some distance between its professed ideals and its actual practices, and that the best one might hope for was occasional moments when that distance narrowed through honest recognition. Miss Dewhurst herself, when asked by Mr. Rowley whether she regretted the loss of her anonymity, considered the question carefully before responding. "I regret the necessity that made anonymity seem required," she said at last. "Yet I cannot regret the revelation, for it has brought me something I did not anticipate. The knowledge that kindness, even when hidden, can be recognized and valued once circumstances allow it to be seen. That is no small consolation." Mr. Brooke, returning to his duties with quiet satisfaction, found that his work had become easier in small ways. Requests for assistance were made with greater courtesy. His opinions on parish matters were solicited with greater frequency. These changes were subtle, but they accumulated into a daily experience of being seen and valued rather than merely useful. He carried his responsibilities with the same dedication as before, but the burden of soul knowledge had been lifted, and that made all the difference. The Christmas season that had begun with such careful preparation, and that had been disrupted by a small mystery, now concluded with a deeper understanding of what Christmas might mean when truly observed. Not the display of charity, but its practice. Not the appearance of community, but its reality. Not praise for what is visible, but gratitude for what is done unseen. Larkspur End had learned these lessons, and if the learning had been accompanied by some discomfort and embarrassment that was perhaps the necessary cost of growth, the village polished its surface once more, as villages must, but it did so now with gentler hands and humbler hearts, aware that beneath any surface, however bright, lies truth that deserves attention and respect. And in this awareness, it found not perfection, but something perhaps more valuable: the possibility of being honestly itself, with all the complexity and contradiction that honesty requires. The winter deepened, and then slowly yielded to spring, as winters always do, and life in Larkspur End continued, quieter now, and kinder, and just a little bit wiser than it had been before.